When buying a new mountain bike today, one of the biggest decisions that we have to make is what's the best kind of bike for most of my riding needs? How much travel do I need? What style of bike is going to fit me best? So in my bike fleet, I've got 3 mountain bikes. I've got a cross-country, down-country style bike, which is a given for my bike fleet because the trails that I ride most often, that bike is perfect. It's the most fun bike to ride. However, I also have a trail bike, which is a specialized Stumpjumper, and I have an all-mountain bike, Enduro bike, which is the Transition Sentinel. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to compare these 2 bikes, and I'm going to hypothetically decide if I had to get rid of one, which one would it be? So I'm staying up in Blue Ridge, Georgia. I'm about 5 minutes from Stanley Gap, and Stanley Gap is one of those trails where you're either climbing or you're descending. So I'm going to pay attention to how these bikes climb and how they descend. So the Stumpjumper is a classic trail bike. It's got 140 travel in the front, 130 in the back, 65.5-degree head angle. You can adjust the geometry a little bit with a flip chip. Whereas the Transition Sentinel, 160 travel in the front, 150 in the back. Both are 29ers. The Transition Sentinel has a 63.5-degree head angle. So on paper, the Stumpjumper should climb better. It's lighter. It's about 1.5 to 2 pounds lighter. The steeper geometry is going to allow the front end to be a little bit more manageable when you're climbing. In other words, you're not going to have to really lean forward as much and really make sure you keep that front end under control. And it should also accelerate better when you're coming up to those sections where there's a root garden, a rock garden, where you've really just got to punch it and get over it. So it should accelerate better. Whereas, again, on paper, the Transition Sentinel should be a better descending bike because of the more travel and also the fact that it's got slacker geometry, so it's going to be more stable. Now, there are situations where a lighter trail bike, like the Stumpjumper, may be a better descending bike when you don't need as much travel. You want to get around stuff, you need a bike that's just more agile, more playful, a little bit lighter feeling. So again, I'm going to pay attention to that on these rides and really decide which one would be best for these style of trails, because the trails that I'm riding today, honestly, are the kind of trails I ride most often when I head to the mountains. There's fast sections, there's steep climbs, there's some rocky and technical sections. And so again, if I had to narrow the choice down to one of these, which one would it be? So today I rode the Stumpjumper, had a great ride, beautiful fall weather, a little bit challenging conditions with a lot of leaves that are coming on the trail, covering up the rocks and roots, which are hard to see not only on the descents, but it was also challenging on the climb sometimes. And so tomorrow I'm going to go back out on the same trails, do pretty much the same loop that I did today on the Transition Sentinel, and then I'll decide which one of these bikes I would choose if I had to choose one of them. Again, not saying I would do that, but I think it'll help some of you out there who may be trying to decide what's the best style of bike that is going to suit my riding needs. So I'm going to pick this video back up tomorrow after my ride on the Transition Sentinel, and I'll give you my conclusions. Which bike do I feel did better? And we'll go from there. All right, it's actually 2 days later from the last scene that I recorded, because I went back out today on the Stumpjumper. So yesterday was the Transition Sentinel Enduro bike, today back on the trail bike. So this is what I found. Climbing is where the bikes felt the most different. The Sentinel front end, the steeper the pitch gets, the lighter the front end feels, for a couple reasons. One is the stem is a bit shorter, the reach is a bit shorter. You feel like the bars are just kind of closer to your stomach, and the bars just move around really easily, almost too easily when you're just clawing your way up. And clawing is probably the best way to describe some of the climbs around here. When it's rooty, when it's rocky, and you're just fighting for all the traction you can get. There were a couple times where my front end on the Sentinel would hit a rock and just, it would take me offline enough to where I had to put my foot down. On those sections, I didn't have quite that problem with the Stumpjumper. Now the Stumpjumper still has a fairly slack head angle, 65.5, so you still have to, you know, really lean forward and really concentrate on controlling the front end. When it gets really steep, it was just exacerbated on the Sentinel. Now, another thing about the Sentinel that I noticed that I kind of really haven't noticed until I rode these bikes back to back on this trip is your center of gravity is a bit higher on the Sentinel, and you just feel a bit more top heavy. And it just, you know, you really are having to move the bike around underneath you to keep it on a straight line. Definitely more noticeable on the Enduro bike. Now, interestingly, there is one section on the Stanley Gap Trail that I ride where I rarely clear it. You've got this big, massive route. You're going up like a 20-degree incline. You're gassed, you're tired. And I actually made it on the Sentinel. And I think it's because the reason that one's so hard to make is there's a root that your back tire hits as soon as you're trying to get the front tire over the big root. The wheelbase on the Sentinel is a little bit longer than the Stumpjumper. It's 1233 millimeters versus 1200 millimeters. And I think just that little bit extra wheelbase length allowed the front tire to hit first before the back tire slammed into that root. I didn't make it on the Stumpjumper. It took me 2 times on the Sentinel, but I did make it. And again, that's one that I've only made a couple times. Something else that's interesting about the Sentinel is it did not feel heavier than the Stumpjumper because of how efficient this bike rides. This Fox Float X2 shock on the Sentinel is excellent. The pedaling platform is excellent, and of course when you're coming downhill it just opens up and is plush. But this bike actually feels very efficient. I wouldn't say more efficient than the Stumpjumper. Now if I just kind of hopped off and back and forth on the bikes on one ride, I'd probably notice the weight difference, but I didn't really notice it on this ride. All right, now let's talk about descending. So this is interesting because you would think that I would prefer the Sentinel on every single descent, and that wasn't the case because of these trails. Now, if you ride just gnarly enduro trails, then yeah, you want to be on an enduro bike. This bike is definitely biased more towards descending, which is obvious because it's an enduro bike, or some people, again, might classify it as an all-mountain bike. So descending on this bike is awesome. It's got, like a shorter reach, your weight is more back, it's got a longer dropper post, it's got a 180 dropper post versus a 150 on the Stumpjumper, and of course the slacker head angle, longer wheelbase is just going to make it more stable on the descents. However, there were some descents where I enjoyed the Stumpjumper more because of its agility. It's just so easy to move that bike around. Not like, again, not night and day difference, but it is more manageable. And by the way, I did ride the Stumpjumper in the low position for both rides that I've done so far up here, and it still felt more manageable. I can put that flip chip in the high position and make it even more agile on the descents. And one of my contacts at Transition Bikes, Lars, told me a couple years ago that on some of the trails he rides up in the Pacific Northwest, that he's actually faster on the spur than the Sentinel, again, just on some sections because of the agility of the bike. So again, just because you're going downhill doesn't mean you want to be on an enduro bike. Sometimes being on a more agile trail bike is going to be more fun, or maybe even a downcountry bike. It just is going to depend on how rough the trails are. So the trails that I rode, there were some rocky sections, and I did not feel underbiked on the Stumpjumper. I love that 140-130 combination for a trail bike. It just made the bike feel just enough travel for everything that I did up here. And again, it's going to depend on the trails that you ride most often. That's probably going to be the theme of the conclusion of this video. It just depends on the trails you ride. Most of the trails that I ride in the Southeast, I actually like the Stumpjumper. Now, there are a few trails that I ride, like Avery Creek up in Pisgah, Bennett Gap, some of the other ones up there. I'd rather be on the Sentinel, and it's worth the more unwieldy feeling up steep single track to have that extra travel, the extra stability on the descent. So it really depends, but I would say 80% of the trails that I ride in the Southeast, the Stumpjumper is perfect. Where the Sentinel really shines, of course, is when the trail gets really rowdy. The stability that you have on this bike is just second to none compared to a trail bike. There were several sections on the Sentinel where instead of trying to get around something, I just plowed right over it. Where I might have gone around it on the trail bike, I just went, plowing right through it, and it was fine. The suspension on this bike just soaked it right up. So on those trails where it's really rough and you prefer an enduro bike, it doesn't mean a trail bike couldn't ride those. You just got to be more selective with your line choice. You've got to, maybe go around something versus going right over it. And maybe you might have to ride it slower. And that's the thing about an enduro bike, is you're just going to be able to hit rough stuff faster than you could on a trail bike. Again, that's pretty obvious to most people, but I just want to throw it out there that you may just have to take your time a little bit more on the downhills. Doesn't mean this bike, trail bike, is not going to be good over rougher trails. You're just going to have to be a little bit more cautious, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've said this before, I'd rather be underbiked than overbiked on a lot of situations. To me, it's just more fun. Lugging around a big heavy bike when you don't need it, not the most fun ride. But you know, the Sentinel actually surprised me of how good it felt on the climbs in terms of the weight. You know, I didn't time myself, but I wouldn't imagine I would be that much slower on the Sentinel, except for those maybe sections where I just went offline and had to put my foot down. At the end of the day, like I said earlier, it's going to depend on the trails that you ride most often. For me, I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning of the video. If I had to choose which one to get rid of, it would be the Sentinel, and I would keep a trail bike. Now, if you're a Transition fan, the next bike down of this one is the Spur, one of my favorite bikes of all time. I just have this feeling that in the next year or two, we're probably going to see a bike between the Spur and the Sentinel. Just my gut feeling. We'll see. If they do, I'm in. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope it was helpful for you. Again, just one that I thought I'd do when I'm up here comparing these bikes. How about you? Let me know in the comments below if you've done a similar comparison between trail and enduro. Which one did you choose, and what types of trails do you ride most often? Any other questions or comments, drop those below. Thanks for watching.